Be aware of Australia's Soviet Liberal government. Martin North. John Adams. In the interest of the people. Well, John, have you gone a bit far this time?
This cash transaction ban issue and the whole everything that we've been doing, and I've been doing for 4 years, and you've been doing much longer. I'm getting to the point that I'm getting quite frustrated in terms of the system. I've been speaking to politicians, publicly, behind the scenes for years on this, going back 2, 3, 4 years, even with my former employer, Synodinos, back in 2012-13, talking about some of these structural imbalances, and we continue to see gridlock in Canberra. We see a government that's basically trying to hide the problem, not tell the public what's really going on. We're seeing a policy direction post-election that's trying to keep the debt bubble intact, stop the crash from happening, and then we're obviously getting ready for a massive onslaught of this unconventional policy. We're seeing these moves around bail-in, around the cash transaction ban bill. And so it's completely headed in the wrong direction. I mean, the government's headed in the wrong direction. I have had numerous conversations with people in the know. The Treasurer is completely clueless. Suka is completely clueless about what's going on. And so I thought this time, because of this cash transaction ban bill, and again, this is such an important piece of legislation in terms of what this says about us. I mean, there are videos on YouTube by Americans who are critiquing us and saying we are becoming, we're living under a tyranny with this sort of law. So our international prestige is being lost by this. And so I thought, in order to continue this campaign as we get closer to the government introducing this legislation to Parliament, I commissioned a cartoonist to put a poster together. And there was a lot of work that went into this cartoon. And so the purpose of this episode is to launch this cartoon in poster form, and hopefully we can make it go viral on the internet. We can print it out and put it all over the country, and again try to educate the public about what is this government really about, and where is this country really going.
Right, and the point I guess to make is that on one hand you expect a Liberal government to be for the independent thinker and to be open-minded and to want effectively a lot of freedoms, right? Yet in fact the exact opposite seems to be playing out, and they sort of got tighter and tighter and more controlling, but also less able to deal with the real issues.
Indeed. When I was in my early 20s, I joined the Liberal Party, and I was a card-carrying member of the Liberal Party for over a decade. So, and obviously I went to go work for them in 12-13 as an economic advisor. So, and then in 2016, before the 2016 election, I quit the party, and then I went on the ABC in a famous clip, and I explained why I quit the party. Now, I joined the Liberal Party because of a certain philosophical outlook, which they historically, said that they did represent, and I quit the party because I believed that they walked away from those core philosophical principles. And again, with this current policy direction that we're seeing from the Morrison government, that they're completely moving in the opposite direction. But the core principles of what the Liberals say they're about is small government, championing freedom, economic freedom, civil liberties, defending the interests of middle-class Australians. And this is a key point, because this is the Menzies Forgotten People speech that was the cornerstone of the establishment of the Liberal Party. It was a call to middle-class Australians Menzies said the rich can look after themselves, the poor have the poor have the union movement, but who's looking after the middle-class Australians? Well, that's what the Liberal Party was supposed to be about. Middle class, professionals, small business people, independent contractors. I mean, that is the core constituency of the Liberal Party. Obviously protecting property rights, going back to the traditions of English thinkers like John Locke, etc., and then obviously defending free market capitalism. So this is the essence of what the Liberal Party says they're about. But obviously, we are seeing a whole host of policies coming out of the government, which, in my view, is the complete antithesis of these core principles.
So my question is, those key points, right? I can see that in history they were definitely there, but I don't see much evidence of it now. So when did you think the shift started, and what has created this shift?
So I think the shift happened during the Howard era. I mean, the Liberal Party, particularly here in New South Wales, started pre-selecting a whole bunch of people who were more interested in power grabbing, Machiavellian political tactics, and had no core philosophical beliefs. So a lot of these politicians, and like the Assistant Treasurer, who I've been told in the last 48 hours has ambitions one day to be Prime Minister. I mean, these people, see Parliament as a way to obtaining power and wealth rather than actually serving the interests of the people, but also pursuing a consistent philosophical outlook. So the people who actually believe in these core principles and who are willing to challenge the party establishment when the government or the machine goes against these principles, they're the ones who don't see the light of day when it comes to pre-selection in terms of getting into Parliament.
My theory was, I think something happened around 9/11, and I think that's one of the triggers that I've noticed, and looking at it more broadly than just Australia. And the focus on security-related issues and the risks, all that sort of stuff, seems to have shifted a whole lot of thinking a long way over. And a lot of civil rights and a lot of independent thinking basically gets shut off now, simply because people are focusing on these other risk-related issues.
Yes. I mean, 9/11 was a key moment in Western thinking, so I would agree with that. But obviously, I think the GFC was also important because the core problems that led to the global financial crisis were never addressed, and all there was band-aids put over the problem of Lehman Brothers, etc. And that band-aid was just to exacerbate the bubble. And now that the bubble is so enormous, they can't do anything but draconian policies to keep the show on the road, because otherwise the whole economy could collapse.
Right, and that comes to the kitchen sink thing, doesn't it? Which, of course, is what we think Morrison government is doing.
We've talked about this in a previous episode. There's a whole host of policies since the election that they have thrown at the bubble to keep it intact, from interest rate cuts to the APRA changes to the income tax cuts to, again, the generous immigration program, the promotion of the tiny homes industry, the introduction of the 5% deposit scheme, which will be coming on 1 January 2020. Now the cash transaction ban bill, which is a precursor to negative interest rates. And so we're seeing a whole set of policies now before the crisis comes into full effect. And yet we're starting to see signals from the Reserve Bank that quantitative easing will come, negative interest rates will come, unconventional policy will come. And obviously it's not just our central bank, but the IMF, other central banks have already flagged that all of this extreme policy is coming down the pike, and all of these extreme policies are clearly not consistent with those core principles that the Liberal Party is supposed to represent.
And I suppose the implication to that then is you've got more power concentrated federally than perhaps previously, and more power perhaps centred in the Reserve Bank than previously.
Indeed. So in terms of the title of the poster, the Soviet Liberal government unleashes communism for the banks. So where did this come from? So once you start to look into this unconventional policy, when you look at quantitative easing, when you look at negative interest rates, I mean, basically what you're doing is, it's helicopter money, it's free money for the banking system, and obviously this is the central bank printing enormous sums of money and then actually engaging, using that money to engage in the private sector and to actually take over parts of the private sector, whether it's through taking over sort of particular assets or banks, or in the case of, say, the Bank of Japan taking over ETFs and shares, etc. So it's an encroachment of the central bank into the private sector, and yes, we are seeing an expansion of economic power by the government, by the central government, the federal government, as well as the RBA. And then obviously, in order to ensure that power is maintained, and there's no ways to get around that regime. I mean, this is why the cash transaction ban bill is so important, because they need to trap people in the system. And obviously, one of the other things when it comes to freedom is the freedom of choice. And certain members of parliament have been telling people in the Liberal Party in the last week that if you do have cash and you want to use that cash above 10,000, just put it in the bank and then just do a bank transaction. And some of these members are saying, but I want to have the choice of not having to use the bank system. And some of these parliamentarians are not fully realising how significant that point is from a choice perspective.
And I suppose quite often what happens is there are a series of steps, but at some point something just says this is too far, right?
Yes.
This is too far from our natural values and our natural point of view. And I think the cash ban is absolutely there, because basically it is trapping people in the system, it's taking away freedoms and choices that people currently have, and it's part of a bigger picture as well. All of those things basically suggest this is the point to really make a stand.
Yes. I mean, look, it's interesting. So this Sunday, the Victorian division of the Liberal Party will be meeting at Caulfield to select the next senator who will replace Senator Fifield. Senator Fifield is retiring from the Senate to become an ambassador for Australia. And I have had multiple people tell me that this cash transaction ban bill has been raised by delegates to various candidates. So there's two leading candidates. Greg Mirabella, who's the husband of the former Shadow Minister Sophie Mirabella, and then there's Sarah Henderson, the former member for Corangamite, who lost her seat at the last election. And so I've been told that Mr. Mirabella has already told internally that he opposes the bill. This is a complete rejection of the core principles of the Liberal Party, and then obviously Miss Henderson hasn't particularly come out with her position, but I've been told that when the delegates answer questions on Sunday, that this particular piece of legislation will be front and centre in terms of some of the questioning within the party. So I mean, there's interesting this week. I've heard from elements of within the Labor caucus that people are unhappy with this legislation, and they're not falling to line behind Mr. Jones's position, who said that Labor will support the bill. And there's obviously internal eruptions within the Liberal Party and the National Party on this. And it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But obviously, having been when I was in the Liberal Party, I mean, I was probably perhaps one of the most right-wing people in the organisation across the country. So I'm a very philosophical person, conservative libertarian, and so one of the biggest insults you can call a liberal is a socialist or a communist. And I've done that plenty in my life. and so what I wanted to do in terms of this poster is to highlight that a whole host of these elements of policy are very typical of a communist or socialist regime in terms of the expansion of federal power, in terms of spending money, in terms of money printing, limiting choice, in terms of devaluing the currency, in terms of limiting competition, in terms of undermining private property rights, but also manipulating prices, manipulating markets, and that's what that's what particularly these negative interest rates policies are. But also trying to boost the property market up, and even the Assistant Treasurer has said, get out there, get a mortgage in. But this is not allowing the free market to operate. This is manipulation by the government and by the Liberal Party, and this is typical of communist and socialist behaviour, and so that's why I came up with the concept of the Soviet Liberal government, having been a former member and former advisor in the Liberal Party. But then obviously the communism for the banks is this direct critique of mine that no, you are giving the banking system all this free money in which the banks can make super profits, and that comes at an expense, and that comes at the expense of the ordinary person. And one thing that we haven't discussed in our previous shows that it's worthwhile talking about, because Max Kaiser on the Kaiser report has spoken about this for the last 6 months, is what they call the Cartelian effect. So Richard Cartelian is an 18th century Irish-French economist He was a banker, speculator, quite wealthy individual, and he came up with a series of monetary theories in a very prominent book written 200 years ago. And this is a theory that he outlined called the Cartelian effect. The people, when you print money and you give, and the people who are close to that that additional money being printed, when they get that money, they can then take advantage of that of those freshly printed currency, and they can go buy assets or goods or services, and obviously buy those things before prices rise, and then everyone else who gets access to additional credit or money later on in the system, they actually have to buy those goods, services, assets at higher prices, and so this is why money printing actually leads to wealth inequality. So there's a lot of discussion about wealth inequality, and a lot of it is due to central bank money printing and the money creation in the commercial banking system, because of this, because there is the top 1%. That are largely concentrated in certain sectors. They have the ability to buy assets with very cheap sources of money, whereas everyone else has to buy those inflated assets at more expensive interest rates, and that's how the ordinary citizen's standard of living declines over time.
Right. So this is fundamentally an observation about how inequality works.
Yes.
Right. And basically
how inequality works as a result of monetary extension.
Correct. I was going to say those closest to the money, as it were,
yes,
can benefit the most, can react more quickly, whereas those further away from it essentially don't get the same benefits, and
exactly.
They're therefore disadvantaged. And if you want to see an example of that, look at the US, because since the GFC and all the money printing over there, the inequality ratios have got even more extreme. So therefore we know that there are some sectors of the population that have done really, really well, but the broader population has not.
Yes, so you can talk. So US is an extreme example, but I mean, even Andrew Leigh, who's a federal member of Parliament under Labor, has talked openly and has written a full book and quoted statistics about how wealth inequality has become a more prominent issue in Australia over the last 20, 30 years. And why is that? It's because of the bubble, and those at the top were able to take advantage of the bubble because they had, particularly the banks and the property sector, because of their proximity to the money printing relative to the rest of the population.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the ABS was criticised quite recently in The Guardian and elsewhere because through a Freedom of Information disclosure, they actually had to disclose how they had actually downplayed the inequality in Australia in some of the recent statistics. So there's an interesting evidence base here that even in Australia, nobody wants to talk about the inequality, but actually we know that inequality is really significant at the moment.
Yeah.
So John, we've talked about the context. Now let's talk about the poster, a bit of a drum roll, right? Because it's worth looking at this poster in some detail because there's lots of things going on here, isn't there?
And the cartoonist is a cartoonist from Melbourne. His name is Danny Zemp. He's an independent cartoonist. So he's a great guy to work with. We actually went through 12 versions of this too, because I was very particular about certain details about how certain people were to look and what sort of picture we wanted to be able to, and story we wanted to be able to tell. So in my view, 5 key elements. So obviously in the middle we have the Prime Minister. We have the Prime Minister dressed in Soviet fatigue because he's the Soviet leader, in my view. We have his right hand being pointing up, top at the RBA with the helicopter money. But we also have his left hand that is tightly fisted. And I asked for that to be drawn that way because of the draconian cash transaction ban bill, which is another element of the poster. So there's obviously the two sides of Morrison, which is free money for the banks and the vested interests, like the property sector, but also a draconian totalitarian sort of impulse to impose greater laws and greater control over the population. So that's element number one. Obviously, element number two of the poster is the banner at the top, and obviously the title of the banner is "The Soviet Liberal Government Unleashes Communism for the Banks," and then obviously element three is the RBA in the helicopter unleashing all of this free money on the banking system, and we have the banks, we have all the monopoly bankers enjoying all of this free money, and obviously that goes to the cartelian effect. So the RBA prints all this money. The banks obviously create their own sort of sources of credit as well. They're having a big party. They're all enjoying the super profits, etc. And they're all getting rich. And so, people in the banking system have been paid extraordinarily well during this expansion of the bubble, but also people who have owned shares in banks have actually done quite well. That's point one. And then obviously those associated with the banking system, like the property sector, because we've got a household debt bubble, they have also enjoyed it. So that's element two. The next element to talk about is on the right hand side of the poster is about the cash transaction ban bill. And so, we specifically had, the bill and the name of the bill sort of drawn up, but we also have a individual holding $10,000 in cash being locked in jail. Obviously, we've had a lot more press on this issue in the last couple of weeks now. But when I had showed some people, an early version of the poster, they asked me, "Why is that person in jail?" And I said, and I actually explained what this whole bill is about. So hopefully, if people are not aware of this of this cash ban issue, and they see the poster, and they see someone being locked up holding a pile of cash, maybe they'll actually trigger them, well, why is that person in jail, and what was his crime? And obviously they can see that there's a piece of legislation that is sort of central there. So that's element 4. And then obviously element 5 is the actual people itself.
I think it's worth John talking in more detail about the people down the bottom of the poster, right? Because there are some very important themes there, aren't there?
Yeah. So what I tried to do with this fifth element in terms of the poster, I wanted to try to encapsulate all of the various constituencies that have struggled with all of this policy from the build up of the debt, from the cost of living pressures, from the property bubble. But also from some of the behaviour of the banks pre-Royal Commission. So a number of all of these people have been carefully selected to represent different constituencies, and some of these constituencies we have spoken about on previous episodes. So going from left to right, we have the farmer. We have the homeless individual. We have an immigrant, because we've had a high migration intake, and that immigrant is obviously going to the bank looking for a loan. We have a whole bunch of we have some middle class Australians, ordinary people suffering because of mortgage stress. We have an individual who is holding like a sheet with saying debt, because debt is a problem for him. We have fly workers, miners who are struggling with excessive debts and financial pressures. That has been a big issue in WA and Queensland. We have single mothers. So we have one person holding a baby and holding bills, because some single mothers are suffering from cost of living pressures. We have middle class people who have experienced relationship breakdown because of financial problems, and this is the individual who's holding divorce papers. We have and it's quite sort of graphic, but we do have a woman who has a black eye, and that's to represent the show that we did, the second show we did early this year, where we talked about postcode 2570, which is southwest Sydney, Camden, where the former Minister Goward saw there was a spike in domestic violence in that area, went to the local police command, and the police said the domestic violence was caused by mortgage stress. So that's not to so that character is not to say that mortgage stress is the reason for every form of domestic violence in Australia, but there is some anecdotal and statistical evidence that financial pressure because of the bubble has led to domestic violence problems, and obviously one of the other so we have a couple of people in the middle, elderly people who have some blankets over their shoulders, because there is evidence around that because of cost of living pressures, and some of it is because of monetary policy, some of it is because of energy policy, which is something slightly different. But there are particularly elderly people who have struggled to pay electricity prices, and some people have gone to sleep cold. And there is a future show that I want to do with you about. There was a recent study from a Melbourne hospital where they looked at presentations around patients who have hypothermia, and recent cases, particularly among elderly people, is due because they can't afford heating bills. So that's something that I want to sort of go into at a future point. So I thought that was important to represent. And obviously one of the last characters is we have a drug dealer, because when you look at, say, Perth, you look at Mandurah, meth, ice, drugs is a big issue, and a lot of the people getting involved in that are seeking some form of escape because of the financial pressures that the WA property market is showing. And that's obviously not me saying that. This is when I was even speaking with members of the WA State Parliament when I was over in Perth a couple of months ago. That was one of their observations about some of their local constituents. So a broad array of Australians being represented among the people, but I thought it was important to try to bring all of these characters to bear, so that the viewers of the poster can understand that there's a wide and broad impact as to who is really suffering.
Yeah, and so if you think about the interests of the people, the interests of all of those people down at the bottom third of the poster, right, are completely opposed to effectively what's happening at the top of the poster, where you've got the banks and the helicopter money and all of that stuff, right?
Yes.
And I think, to me, it fundamentally highlights the disconnect between the greater proportion of Australians and the elite and what they're up to.
Of course, and that's obviously what I wanted to sort of portray, and this is obviously where the communism for the banks come from. So the expansion of the state, all of the spending, all of the money printing, it's going to the elites, it's going to the cartel, the banks, etc. They're getting all the benefit, the super profits. They're living a fantastic life in this country, and yet middle class Australians will experience greater forms of hardship. In the months and years to come, when this crisis that we've been talking about comes into full fruition.
So I guess the next thing to talk about before we finish off then is, how are you going to promote this poster, and what do you want people to do with it?
So I've written an article that's on my website, adamseconomics.com, that goes into some of the economic explanation about what the poster is all about. I have written a press release as well that I'll put on my website as well. That's more political, and that's a political statement from me as a former Liberal advisor about my outrage against the Morrison government and what they're trying to do to the country with all of these policies. I will be promoting this through the press, and we'll see if the press picks it up. I'll be putting the image on the post on social media. I encourage everyone to spread the image across Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever you want to use. If people want the image and they can't get it from social media, send me an email. I can send the image and people can download it and then use it and spread it around. The CEC will also be publishing the image on their website. They are producing physical posters that they will be circulating as well. One of our ambitions is to put this poster on every university campus across the country. So if you are a university student, if you would like a poster, contact me or contact Robbie, and we will get you a poster, and hopefully we can try to spread this around and bring attention again to the problems facing the country, the wrongness of where the government's thinking is at, and the wrongness of current policy and future policy, and hopefully again, with this cash transaction ban bill, with these unconventional extreme monetary policies, more attention, more pressure can hopefully, try to get the politicians to think about these problems in a completely different way.
Yeah, it is truly in the interest of the people.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.